Welcome to the Old Testament Survey. I'm Dr. Myers, and I'm with the Institute for Biblical and Scientific Studies. We just want to welcome you, and a little formality on how to use this program. There are buttons on the bottom. You can click on the right to forward to the next slide, on the left to click to go back to the previous slide, and at the bottom you can exit the program at any time, and other navigational buttons at the bottom. Here we have a great overview of world history and biblical history, and there's some key dates here to remember. Around 2000 BC, we have Abraham, and Egypt is in dominant control of Canaan at this time. Moses about 1500 BC, and then about 1000 BC, we have the United Kingdom, we have David. So there's 1,000 years between 2000 BC and 1000 BC where Egypt is control of Canaan. Then we go with the United Kingdom in 1000 BC with David, and it splits apart into the northern and southern kingdom, Israel in the north, Judah in the south, and this is around 930 BC. You can think of it something like in the United States you have the north and the south, and there was a civil war and they split apart. Well, the same thing happened back in 930 BC. Then another key date is 722 BC. This is when Assyria came, attacked the capital of Samaria, and destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. It was not able to capture Jerusalem, and Judah stayed on as an independent nation until 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar came, the king of Babylon, and destroyed Jerusalem in 586 BC. In 612 BC, Nineveh was destroyed and fell. So these are some key dates. Abraham, 2000 BC. David, 1000 BC. The division of the north in the south, 930 BC. Then the fall of Israel, the northern kingdom, at 722 by the Assyrians. And then 586 BC, the fall of Jerusalem. Memorize these key dates. This will help you in biblical history. Here we have some more key dates for biblical history. We already discussed 586 BC, the fall of Jerusalem. Babylon is ruling. In 539 BC, Babylon falls to Cyrus the Great. We have the great Persian Empire in control. We have Ezra in 458 BC. During this time is also Esther. In 445 we have Nehemiah, all during the Persian Empire. Then a key date, 332 BC, we have Alexander the Great, and the great Greek Empire comes to power. In 323 we have Alexander's death, and it's divided among the generals, and we have, especially affecting Israel, we have the Seleucids who rule from Syria, and then in Egypt we have the Ptolemies who rule, and they sort of fight over Israel. And so sometimes Israel's controlled by the Seleucids, and other times it's controlled by the Ptolemies, and it's fighting back and forth until 167 BC. There's the Maccabean revolt. Judas Maccabees defeats Antiochus, and they become an independent state. And we have the rule of the Hasmoneans until 63 BC, when Pompey comes and takes Jerusalem, conquers Jerusalem. And now we have the rule of the Romans on into the time of the New Testament. So these are key dates here. We have the fall of Babylon in 539 and the rule of the Persian Empire. 332 BC, we have the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great. In 167 BC, we have the Maccabean revolt and independence. And then in 63 BC, we have the Romans taking over. These are key dates to remember for especially Old Testament history. We want to take here a complete overview of the Bible. We have the Old Testament and we have the New Testament. There are 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament. The Old Testament looks forward to the coming Messiah, to Christ's coming. In the New Testament, we're looking back at Christ's coming. So these are two key things to remember about the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Bible divided into two main parts. When I first read through the Old Testament, I thought it was going to be just like an ordinary book where you start from the beginning and go all the way to the end, chronologically. But the Old Testament is not arranged chronologically. It is arranged topically. You can divide the Old Testament into four main groups. You have the law, or also called the Torah, which is the first 5 books, the books of Moses. Then you have 12 books of history, and these may overlap at the end as well. Then you have 5 books of poetry, and then finally you have 17 books of prophets or prophecies. So it's not just a chronological story, but it's arranged topically. The Old Testament is divided up into 4 main parts. There's the law, history, poetry, prophecy. When I first read through the Bible, I thought it was just starting from Genesis, the beginning of time, and then ends right before the New Testament. And it was just like a timeline story. But it isn't. It's divided up topically. This happened with this Greek translation called the Septuagint. They arranged the books of the Old Testament topically. So it's not just one chronological story at all, but arranged topically. And you have the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, as Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the 5 books of the law, or Moses. Then the second division is history, the history books, 12 books. And then you have the poetry section of 5 books of poetry. And then, which includes Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. The last division is prophecy. 17 books of prophecy. You have the major prophets and the minor prophets that make up this section of prophecy. So remember, it's divided up topically into these 4 divisions: law, history, poetry, and prophecy. The ancient Jews divided the Old Testament, their Bible, which they called the Tanakh, into law and the prophets. They also divided it in 3 ways: the law, prophets, and writings. And the writings were the Psalms. The law was called Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible. So you have a different division and a different collection and order in the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh. And we see even in the New Testament the 2 ways the Jews divided it into either the law and the prophets, or they made a 3rd division: law, prophets, and writings. Luke 24:44 says, "And he said unto them, These are the words which I spake unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses, and in the prophets, and in the Psalms concerning me." So in this verse we have the 3-fold division of the Old Testament. Here we have another visualization of the first 5 books of the law, the Torah. We have Genesis, the book of beginnings, which gets its name from the very first word, Bereshith, meaning in the beginning. Then we have the book of Exodus. They're exiting from Egypt. Leviticus is the Levite laws. Numbers, they're numbered in the wilderness. Deuteronomy, Deutero, the second giving of the law. These are the 5 books of Moses. The next major section is history, 12 books of history. Now we have law, history, poetry, and prophecy, the 4 major divisions. Some include the book of Moses in with history and say there's only three major divisions: history, poetry, and prophecy. But we want to look at the history section, and that includes the books Joshua, telling about the conquering of Canaan; Judges, when the judges rule; Ruth, about the redeemed; 1 Samuel, about King Saul; 2 Samuel, about King David; 1 Kings tells us about the united kingdom and Elijah; 2 Kings tells us about the divided kingdom, and we have the Elisha. Then we have 1 Chronicles, Chronicles of King David, and 2 Chronicles, Chronicles of Judah's kings. Here again we look at the 12 books of history in this nice little chart here, and we have Joshua with the conquering of Canaan, Judges when they rule, Ruth the Redeemer. 1 Samuel is about Saul and Samuel. 2 Samuel, King David. 1 Kings, about Solomon and Elijah. 2 Kings, you have the divided kingdom and Elisha. 1 Chronicles, King David. 2 Chronicle, Judah's kings. Ezra is reform. Nehemiah is rebuilding and revival, and Esther, queen, and the Feast of Purim. These are the 12 books of history. Let's look again at world history and putting this into perspective. We have at 2000 BC, we have Abraham. 1500 BC, Moses. 1000 BC, we have the United Kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon. Now between 2000 and 1000 BC, Egypt is under the control of Canaan. Then with the United Kingdom, we have a split in 930 BC under Rehoboam. And the kingdom splits into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And then in 722, the Assyrians come, destroy the northern kingdom, and take Israel away captive. Judah is still independent and still continues on all the way to 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar comes and destroys Jerusalem and takes them into exile. We now want to look at the book of Joshua. Theme is conquering Canaan. The conquest of the land is in chapters 1 through 12. You have a central campaign, a southern campaign, and a northern campaign. And then in the final chapters 13 through 24, you have a division of the land among the 12 tribes. One of the most famous stories in the book of Joshua is the fall of Jericho. The walls of Jericho come tumbling down. This is part of the central campaign to cut off the north and the south. Jericho falls. Another amazing story in the book of Joshua is that the sun stands still for Joshua in chapter 10. An amazing story. So in Joshua, we have the conquering of Canaan. We have the conquest of the land in chapters 1 through 12, with the central campaign cutting across first, then a southern campaign, and then a northern campaign. And then finally, the division of the land among the 12 tribes in chapters 13 through 24. We now come to the book of Judges. Probably the most famous judge is Samson and his strength. But there are a number of other deliverers. And you have this cycle of oppression, and then a deliverer is raised up to rescue them from their oppression. You have Mesopotamian oppression, and Othniel is raised up. You have the Moab oppression, and Ehud rises up. You have the Philistine oppression, and you have Shamgar. You have Hatzor, and Deborah is the deliverer. Midian, you have another famous judge, Gideon, who delivers them. Then you have Ammon's oppression, and Jephthah is raised up. Then you have the Philistines, and Samson is raised up to deliver them. So we have a number of judges, a number of oppressions, cycles here in the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, there are cycles of sin. You have apostasy. They turn away from the Lord. God sends judgment, a form of oppression. They repent, and then God sends a deliverer, and they are restored. But then they fall back into apostasy again, and God has to bring judgment again, and they repent again. God sends a deliverer and restores them again. So you have this cycle in the book of Judges. And during this time of the Judges, you have the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth takes place during the time of when the Judges ruled. Because of a famine, Naomi's family traveled from Bethlehem to Moab, where her two sons married Ruth and Orpah. Naomi's husband and sons died, so she returns back to Bethlehem with Ruth. Ruth has no husband, so Boaz becomes the kinsman redeemer by marrying Ruth. She bears a son, Obed, who is the great-grandfather of King David. The key verse of this book is Ruth chapter 1 verse 16. For whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou leadest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Now we're continuing on with the history books. We have 1 Samuel, and it's about King Saul and the prophet Samuel. 2 Samuel is about King David and the prophet Nathan. 1 Kings is about King Solomon, and you have the prophet Elijah. So we have a different king in each book and a different prominent prophet in each book. So we have 1 Samuel, King Saul and Samuel. 2 Samuel, King David and Nathan. 1 Kings, Solomon and Elijah. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, we have the very famous story of David killing Goliath. And in the background is a picture of a Philistine. And so this may be what Goliath looked like. This is on the mortuary temple of Ramses III in Egypt. Now, the United Kingdom, there are 3 kings. The first king is Saul, then David, and then Solomon. And Solomon is the one who built the temple to the Lord. During the reign of King Solomon, we have the famous visit of the Queen of Sheba. And it's pictured here. So again, to review, we have the United Kingdom. King Saul. King David is about 1000 BC. Then we have King Solomon, and Solomon's temple was built about 960 BC. We now come to the history books concerning the divided kingdom, which happened in 930 BC. Under Rehoboam, they rebel, and it splits into the northern kingdom of Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel, and the southern kingdom of Judah. And this is 2 Kings. We have the divided kingdom, and we have the prophet Elisha. In 2 Chronicles, we have the Chronicles of King David. This parallels 1 Kings. Then we have 2 Chronicles, and that's the Chronicles of Judah's kings, and this parallels 2 Kings. Now the Chronicles were written after they came back from captivity, so this is a view of the kings and kingdoms from a viewpoint of after the Babylonian captivity. In 926 BC, Pharaoh Shishak attacks Jerusalem and carries off the treasure of the temple. And we have Shishak pictured on the walls in the temple at Karnak in Egypt. And so some think that the Ark of the Covenant was taken back to Egypt when this attack happened. So we have the divided kingdom, 930 BC, in 1st and 2nd Kings. The beginning you have Solomon, and then it divides up. Then you have the prophets Elijah and Elisha during the time of the divided kingdom. And here we have a view from Mount Carmel where Elijah called down fire from heaven and the 450 prophets of Baal were killed. You're looking out over the modern city of Haifa. Now, the division of the kingdom, don't forget, 930 BC. We have the northern kingdom of Israel. The first king is King Jeroboam. He led the rebellion against Rehoboam and established the capital at Shechem. Later, it was moved to Samaria, where we have Ahab built his palace. In the southern kingdom of Judah, King Rehoboam reigns at Jerusalem, and that remains the capital of Judah. Now, when we look at the northern kingdom of Israel, all the northern kings did not follow the Lord. They're portrayed as evil, bad kings, all of them in the kingdom, the northern kingdom of Israel. There are 4 main dynasties. You have the dynasty of Jeroboam, who led the rebellion against Rehoboam and established the northern kingdom in 931 to 909 BC. Then you have the dynasty of Baasha in 909 to 885 BC. Then you have the dynasty of Omri, 885 to 841. And the most famous king here is King Ahab and his queen Jezebel. Then you have the dynasty of Jehu in 841 to 752 BC. And then you have the last kings, and in 722 BC, Assyria comes down from the north, captures the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, and take them back to the Syrian lands. Here in the background we have a picture of King Jehu bowing before the Assyrian king Shalmaneser III. This is about 841 BC. It's called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, and it's in the British Museum. And this one key scene depicts them bringing tribute, Israel bringing tribute, and the King Jehu bowing down before the Assyrian king. This is the first known drawing of the Israelites in history. Now, there may be some other questionable drawings, but this one we know for sure, the Assyrians depicting the Israelites here. Now, the northern kingdom of Israel went into Assyrian captivity in 722 BC. The Assyrians came down and besieged the capital of Samaria for 3 years before it was destroyed by Sargon II. So Samaria held out for 3 years before it was taken captive. Now, the northern kingdom was taken into captivity And now we want to look at the southern kingdom of Judah. Now there were only 7 good kings, and we've highlighted them in yellow: Jehoshaphat, Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, Jotham, and Josiah. So these are the only good kings. 2 kings started out good but turned bad. That was Rehoboam and Asa. And 1 king started out bad, Manasseh, and turned out good in the end. So these are the list here of all of the kings in the southern kingdom of Judah, 19 in all, and they lasted longer than the northern kingdom. Now, the southern kingdom of Judah lasted until 586 BC, when Jerusalem finally fell to Nebuchadnezzar and was taken into captivity, and the Jews were taken back to Babylon. Now let us look at an overview of the whole timeline of the Old Testament. We start out with creation, fall, flood, the Tower of Babel. This is all in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Then about 2000 BC we have the patriarchs. The 4 patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They go down into Egypt. And then Moses leads them out of Egypt. Joshua leads them into the promised land. And then you have the period of the judges. And then at about 1000 BC you have a complete united kingdom of all the tribes of Israel. The first king is Saul. Then we have David. Then Solomon. Solomon's son Rehoboam takes over, and there's a rebellion, and Rehoboam leads the rebellion, and the 10 tribes separate, and it's called the northern kingdom of Israel. And then we just have the southern kingdom of Judah in the south. In 722 BC the Assyrians come and destroy Israel and take Israel away captive back to Assyria and the different lands about. And these are known as the 10 lost tribes. Judah continues on, and in 586 BC Nebuchadnezzar comes, attacks Jerusalem, destroys Jerusalem, and takes the Jews captive back to Babylon, where they're in exile. Then in 539 BC, Cyrus the Great comes, destroys Babylon, frees the Jews so they can return back home. And we have Ezra returning back. We have Nehemiah returning. And then we have the story of Esther. Nebuchadnezzar took Jerusalem in 586 BC and brought captives to Babylon, where they stayed for almost 50 years there in Babylon, till Cyrus the Great came and conquered Babylon. And here we have a picture of with the decree of Cyrus, allowing the people to return to their homelands. This is called the Cyrus Cylinder, and it has this decree on here. And so the Jews are allowed to return to Jerusalem in 539 BC. And this period of time is called the post-exilic period. When they're in Babylonian exile, it's called the exilic period. And now when they return back home after 539 BC, it's called the post-exilic period. And during this time, we have Ezra, the reformer. We have a restoration under Zerubbabel in the book of Ezra, the first 6 chapters. And then last chapters, Ezra 7 through 10, we have the Reformation under Ezra. So the book of Ezra is all about reform and restoration. The post-exilic period begins with the return of the Jews to Jerusalem in 538 BC. Zerubbabel rebuilds the temple. Ezra chapters 1 through 6. You have the prophets Haggai and Zechariah encouraging him to rebuild the temple. The temple was finally finished in 516 BC. We have Ezra's reform. Ezra returns to the land in 458 BC. He reads the law. There's reformation under Ezra. And this is in Ezra chapters 7 through 10. The great reform under Ezra. We have the book of Nehemiah after the exile. Nehemiah requests to go rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And there's revival. This is about 445 BC. He sees the conditions of the wall and rebuilds the walls. And revival sets in. The book of Esther takes place during this time period after the exile. Esther becomes queen, and most likely it was under the rule of King Xerxes of Persia. The Feast of Purim celebrates the victory of the Jews over their enemies, especially Haman. God's providence is seen here. Although God's name is not mentioned at all in the book of Esther, it can be found in acrostic form. Let's look at the major events of the history books, the 12 history books. We have the kingdom divides in about 930 BC. We have the northern kingdom going away into captivity in 722 BC. We have the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And the Jews are exiled in Babylon from this time, 586 to 539 BC. In 539, Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon, and the Jews are allowed to return to Jerusalem. We have the post-exilic period. Then, after the end of the book of the Old Testament, Malachi, there's 400 silent years from the ending of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New Testament. So the Old Testament doesn't just leave off and the New Testament begins right away. There are 400 silent years in between, and a lot of things happen in that time period. Let's see how some of this relates to the world history and biblical history. We have a nice chart here. In 539 BC, we have Cyrus the Great, the fall of Babylon, and the decree for the Jews and others to return home. And the Jews return back to Jerusalem the next year. Then, Cambyses II, he conquers Egypt. And you can read about this in Herodotus. Then Darius I takes over, 521. approves the completion of the temple, and the decree is written down and recorded in Ezra chapter 4, verses 24 through 26. We have by Darius I the commission of the Histum inscription, a key inscription like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked for us to be able to figure out what ancient cuneiform said. This is the time of Haggai and Zechariah. Then we have Xerxes, who went to war with Greece. And we have the famous story of the 300 Spartans who held off the Persian army. This is the same king whom chose Esther to be queen. And we have the story, the book of Esther and the feast of Purim in celebration. Then we have Artaxerxes I, 465 to 425 BC. And he allows Nehemiah to rebuild Jerusalem's walls in 445 BC. Then we have finally Darius III, who is defeated by Alexander the Great at the Battle of Issus. And then we have the beginning of the Greek Empire with Alexander the Great in 332 BC. Now, we have Malachi about 430 BC. And we have from Malachi to the New Testament, to John the Baptist and Jesus, we have 400 silent years where there is no prophet until John the Baptist. So we have this all under the Persian Empire and then the Greek Empire. We've covered a lot of material in history, so we want a quick review. There are 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. The Old Testament is arranged topically, not chronologically. You can divide the Old Testament into 4 groups: law, history, poetry, and prophecy or prophets. You have the 5 books of Moses, the law. You have 12 books of history. You have 5 books of poetry and 17 books of prophecy or the prophets. The major theme of the Old Testament is salvation. We have 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books in the New Testament, for a total of 66 books in the Bible. The Old Testament looks forward to Christ's coming. The New Testament looks back at Christ's coming, and then forward again to when he shall return. So this gives us an overview, the theme of salvation, of Christ coming. An overview of the Bible. There are 66 books in the Bible, 39 in the Old Testament, which looks forward to Christ's coming. We have 27 books in the New Testament that look back at Christ's coming, and yet forward again to when he returns. So this is a quick overview of the Bible. Let's review again the biblical history. We have around 2000 BC, we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph going down into Egypt, and then Moses bringing them back out around 1500 BC. All this time, Egypt is in control of Canaan. Then we have Joshua leading them in and conquering the land. We have the judges ruling. Then about 1000 BC, they're tired of judges and they want a king. And so we have a united kingdom of Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon's son Rehoboam, they don't like him, and Jeroboam leads rebellion, splits the nation into two, to the divided kingdom. In the north you have Israel, in the south you have Judah. Then in 722 the Assyrians come and destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. They're taken away captive. Then Judah still continues on until the Babylonians come and destroy Jerusalem in 586 BC. And then they're taken away captive to Babylon. We continue on with Babylon in control, and they're in captivity there in Babylon. And then in 539, Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon and issues the decree that they can return to their homeland. So the Jews return to Jerusalem in 538 BC. We have the Persian Empire, under which Esther becomes queen. We have Ezra being allowed to go back in 458 BC. Then again, Nehemiah goes to repair the walls of the city in 445 BC. Then we have Alexander the Great coming, world conquest in 332 BC, and finally dies in 323. This sets up, divided among the generals, you have, especially related to Israel, you have the Seleucids in Syria in the north, and you have the Ptolemies in Egypt in the south, and they battle it out for control over Israel. Then in 167 BC, we have a revolt, the Maccabean revolt, led by Judas Maccabees. There was a pig offered on the altar, and the priest rebels, and the family of the Maccabees revolt and lead them to victory and independence. It's also called the Hasmonean period. And then the Romans rise to power, and 63 BC, Pompey conquers Jerusalem, and now the Romans are in control. So we have the four divisions. We have law, history, poetry, prophecy or prophets. The law, 5 books. We have the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Genesis is the book of beginnings. Exodus is the exit from Egypt. Leviticus is all about the Levite laws. Numbers, they're numbered in the wilderness. Deuteronomy, Deuto, 2, the second giving of the law. After the 5 books of the law, we have the 12 books of history. We have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. In 1st Kings, we have the split of the kingdom in 930 BC. And then at the end of Chronicles, we have the Jews returning, 538 BC, with Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Joshua, we have conquering Canaan. Judges, the judges rule. Ruth, we have a redeemer. Samuel, 1 Samuel is about Saul and Samuel. 2 Samuel about King David and the prophet Nathan. 1 Kings, you have Solomon and the prophet Elijah. 2 Kings, we have the divided kingdom and the prophet Elisha. 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a repeat of 1st and 2nd Kings. Only the Chronicles were written during or after the exile. Some think Ezra may have written these Chronicles. So it's a post-exilic look back at the kingdom and why it fell and to give hope. So we have 1st Chronicles about King David, 2nd Chronicles, Judah's kings. Then we come to Ezra, returning and starting reform. Then we have Nehemiah, who returns to rebuild the walls and have revival. And then we have Esther, Queen Esther, and the Feast of Purim. Here is the Old Testament timeline to give you a better perspective here. We have Genesis, we have creation, the main key events in Genesis 1 through 11. We have 4 key events: creation, fall, flood, Tower of Babel. Then around about 2000 BC, you have the patriarchs, the 4 patriarchs in Genesis: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Then Joseph is taken down into Egypt. Then we have Moses leading them out of Egypt. We have Joshua leading them into the land of Canaan and conquering Canaan. We have the judges rule. They don't like the way the judges rule. They want a king. And so Saul is anointed king, and the United Kingdom starts about 1000 BC. We have Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon's son Rehoboam, they don't like, and Rehoboam causes a revolt and splits the kingdom into the northern kingdom of Israel and Rehoboam, the southern kingdom of Judah. And they remain separate till 722 BC. The Assyrians come and conquer Israel, and some flee south to the kingdom of Judah. Judah lasts longer till 586, till when Nebuchadnezzar comes, conquers Jerusalem, and takes most of them off to exile and captivity in Babylon. In 539, Cyrus conquers Babylon and sets the Jews and others free to return home. Then we have the post-exilic time, where Ezra returns, Nehemiah returns to build the walls, and we have Esther becoming queen. And this gives you a general outline of the whole Old Testament. Here are some resources that you can go to. There's the Old Testament Survey. I'm not sure if these books are still in print. You have the Unger's Bible Handbook. You have Bible charts and maps. Simply Understanding the Bible. The one that follows closely to what I think is happening is the Bible as History by Ian Wilson. And this has a lot of archaeology in the Bible and how it fits together, Bible and history. And this seems to agree mostly with some of my views. Here we have some college level books. So this is the higher college level, the History of Israel by John Bright, and a survey of the Old Testament, an introduction by Gleason Archer. So these are two good ones to give you a good survey at a college level. Congratulations, you have completed your course of the Old Testament Survey module. This is created by the Institute for Biblical and Scientific Studies. You can go to www.bibleandscience.com for a lot more information, articles, other courses. And I'm your teacher, Dr. Stephen Myers. Thank you.